firstly, thank you to the Culture Association for the honour of doing this speech today. History teaches us lessons for the future. Voices call us from the mists of time. They educate us and beg us not to repeat the errors of the past. Unfortunately, these voices are not always heeded. Let me take you back 500 years and hear those voices, perpetuated by both historians and poets. By the early 1500s, the borders of England and Scotland had been at each other's throats for hundreds of years. Murderous raids and skirmishes occurred nightly. It was in fact that a single Reaver family could hot-rod 2,000 horsemen, leaving a trail of mayhem and destruction in their wake. Legend has it that the border conflict made America's Wild West look like child's play. It was a very dangerous place to live. Survival of the fittest prevailed. The Reavers' mission was to shake loose the border, and the devious approach was so cunning that it was said they could have turned Jesus himself into a criminal. So in the midst of all this turmoil, why did the Battle of Flodden happen in this field in 1513? In 1503, Scotland's King James had married Henry VII's daughter, and the two countries had signed a treaty of perpetual peace. This brought peace between the two countries that had waged intermittent warfare for 200 years. So everything in the garden was rosy, or was it? Three major events changed the game. Firstly, in 1509, a new king came to the English throne, Henry VIII, a charismatic ruler, extravagant, lustful, and power-hungry. Secondly, in 1512, James and Margaret had a son, an heir, a threat to Henry. Thirdly, when England went to war with France in 1513, James chose to honour the old alliance with France, which dated back to 1295, rather than honour his own treaty of peace with England and his brother-in-law. Tensions between England and Scotland escalated exponentially. In August 1513, with Henry fighting in France, Scotland and its king rolled the dice, raised an army, and invaded England, looking to split Henry's forces on two fronts. In 1513, James could call on every man between 16 and 60 to fight for 40 days a year. These men were not paid or fed, it was their duty, and they came to this field in their thousands 509 years ago. History portrays James IV as the greatest Stuart king. He was intelligent, multilingual, deeply religious. He is seen as an enlightened king, but had he made the right call? I am sure he was confident when he stood on this very hill overlooking Branxton. Facing James was Thomas Howard, an experienced old soldier. He had fought for 4 English kings. He had been at Richard III's side at Bosworth Field. He was the loser that day. But fate plays strange hands, and fate had provided an opportunity for Thomas Howard's redemption. Victory would give him immortality. What of battlefield numbers that day? Probably 30,000 Scots and 25,000 Englishmen took the field on that wet September afternoon, with 7,000 horses between them. Both sides had cannons, the English guns smaller and more flexible, the Scottish guns massive weapons, slow to load. They may have blown up castles, but could they put a dent in a mobile English army? Late in the afternoon, the two massive armies engaged in the rain and mud. The Scots advanced. The Scots advanced using 12-foot long pikes. But pike warfare requires perfect precision. Tight shoulder-to-shoulder formations moving at steady pace. The Swiss Guard, the Spartans, the Romans understood this discipline, but lose to control, fail to support your comrades, and momentum in your life is lost. Imagine the noise, the screams, the smoke, the smell. I am sure in some ghostly nights you can still hear the crash as the forces smashed into each other. The cannon fire will have added to the mayhem, along with the clash of horses, the stabbing swords, the sweeping halberds, and the volleys of arrows further darkening the rain-filled skies. The Scottish border riders overlooked the English battalion facing them, but the Scottish pike charge had stopped. The Scots started to throw down their pikes. The king looked to save the day by charging his nobles directly at Howard's command post. In his poem Marmion, Walter Scott wrote, "But as they left the darkening heath, more desperate grew the strife of death. The English shafts and volleys hailed, in headlong charge their horse assailed. Front, flank and rear the squadrons sweep, to break the Scottish circle deep. They fought around their king, but yet through thick the shafts as snow, through charging knights like whirlwinds go. Groom fought like noble, squire like knight, as fearlessly and well, till utter darkness closed her wing o'er their thin host and wounded king." Scots poet William McGonagall wrote, "So Grimmin lords fought all alike, and hard blows for Scotland they did strike, and swords and spears loudly did clatter, and innocent blood did flow like water." James IV and his knights died in their beautifully glorious but ultimately suicidal charge into the maelstrom, as legend has it, just yards from Howard. When it was over, thousands of men lay dead or dying in Flodden field, Scots and Englishmen alike. James's charge had decimated the Scottish nobility. The wailing and the crying in the field would be repeated in thousands of homes as widows cried for lost sons and husbands. As Jean Elliott reminds us in her haunting tune, the flowers of the forest are all weed away. Thomas Howard never pressed home his victory by invading Scotland. Howard fell back into England not wanting to take any risks. He knew battles of this scale turn on small details. The luck was with him that day in Flodden. Howard was given back his titles and his coat of arms was embellished with a rampant half-lion with an arrow through its throat. The nuns from Coldstream Priory took many bodies back to be buried in consecrated ground and showed much mercy that day to the dead and dying. However, thousands of bodies from both sides would have been left to be pillaged where they lay. Why did the Scots lose? They had the larger force and a great position, as you can see from here. But history is a habit of smaller forces winning, perhaps due to complacency or better organisation. The Greeks at Marathon, the Scots at Bannockburn and Stirling Bridge, the English at Agincourt, the British Army at Rorke's Drift, all smaller forces trying over larger. As Wellington said at Waterloo, battles of scale are damn close run things. Perhaps James should have listened to those voices and learnings from the past. Or maybe he should have just attacked the English army as they were moving into position. Flodden is deemed to have marked the end of the Middle Ages. What did it achieve? In the short term, chaos for the Scots, but within decades, the Scottish nation had risen from the ashes. A true testimony to the resilience of the country and its people. The ultimate irony was that only 90 years after Flodden, James VI of Scotland unified the crowns of both England and Scotland. One of the sadder parts of this story is the fate of James's body. It never found a resting place. There are 3 artefacts held in the College of Arms in London: a gold ring, a dagger and a sword donated by Thomas Howard's ancestors in 1681. An examination of these artefacts was carried out in 2013. It concluded that both weapons were dated later than Flodden, but left the tantalising possibility that the sword blade was much earlier. The ring cannot be dated. It all adds to the legend of Flodden. Flodden itself was a key part of the tapestry of our history that brought England and Scotland together. It was a stepping stone towards the peace and security we have today with our neighbours, which our ancestors in 1513 would never have thought possible. I am sure that as men on both sides charged at each other 500 years ago on those muddy slopes, they would have thought a life without conflict and our freedoms today were really worth fighting for. Oops. When today we see Russia fighting in Ukraine, it only underlines the importance of peace and security and teaches us to listen to those voices and warnings from history. I would like to end with a final poem of my own as a tribute to all who fought and died in Flodden Field, and also as a tribute to the people of Coldstream, their riders, and to the organisers and supporters of this event, which will ensure those who fought here with such bravery are always remembered. The poem is entitled Flodden, a Tribute to Past and Present. Men rallied from every corner of their land, marching side by side to force King Henry's hand. Supporting France and the old alliance, destroying border strongholds in acts of defiance. In September 1513 they took to Flodden Field. Each attacked their foe, none would yield. Cannons roared, arrows darkened the sky, smoke shrouded the hillside as thousands fall and die. The rain poured down, soaking marshy ground. By nightfall, the dead and wounded lay all around. Amongst them were nobles, knights and a king. James cut down yards from glory, losing everything. His body torn asunder, any trinket or relics taken. To the victor the spoils, no hope of repatriation. On Flodden Ridge memories reside after all this time, for so many young men destroyed in their prime. At Bryanston and dark nights you can hear them still, legions charging wet slopes, their enemies to kill. The fallen were buried, namelessly never found. Their bravery made Flodden Field a sacred ground. But their spirits still call after these long years, when the widow's wind wails and the rain cries its tears. Now the dust has settled and centuries have passed. The border wars have ceased, although the tales still last. Flodden is cast in legend, but costs so much pain. Our neighbouring lands must avoid conflict ever again. The Coldstream Rideout pays reverence to the chivalry of old, maintaining tradition, not allowing deeds of red souls to go cold. Is carried out with pride, honour and grace. Their clattering